Wyoming Territory, late September 1878. The wind carried a bitter edge, biting down from the Ozarks as if winter had decided to come early. The day had started clear, but by late afternoon, the sky was heavy with clouds and the wind howled across the dry grasslands. That was when she stumbled onto his porch half-frozen, dirt-smudged, and barely upright before collapsing right at his boots. Laziel Zane had just stepped outside with a mug of coffee, still steaming, when the woman dropped to the floorboards like a sack of grain. He crouched fast, setting the mug aside, and turned her over gently. Her lips were cracked. Her dress was torn at the hem, her boots muddy, and one lace broken. A long scratch ran from her cheekbone down to her collarbone, red and fresh. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, steady. Her eyes fluttered open for only a second. "Water," she rasped. He lifted her easily. She could not have weighed more than a bundle of firewood and brought her inside, laying her on the spare bed in the room across from his. He poured a dipper of water and held it to her lips. She drank like she had not in days, nearly choking. "Easy now," he said softly. Her name came the next morning after she had slept through the night under wool blankets, a fire going strong in the hearth. She woke with a start, eyes wide, then narrowed as she tried to sit up. Laziel stood from the chair near the window. "You are safe," he said. "No one is going to hurt you here." She hesitated, scanning the room. Then, with a voice still rough from thirst, she said, "Willa Carr." "I am Laziel Zane," he answered. "Some folks call me Zane. This is my land." "You collapsed on my porch yesterday. I remember," she winced, clutching her ribs. "You are hurt. Just sore. From walking. And falling." He pulled a stool beside the bed. "You are lucky you made it this far. Not much around here but dust and rattlers. I was headed to Elk Hollow. My wagon broke near North Fork." Her voice cracked again, but she pushed through. "My husband passed last winter. I was trying to start over. Got caught in a storm. I thought I could make it." Laziel nodded once. "Storm rolled through fast. You were days out on foot." She nodded. He saw it then, the edge of fear behind her eyes, the raw kind that came from too many losses too close together. "You do not have to walk anymore," he said. She blinked at him carefully, unsure. "You can stay here, rest, until you decide what is next." Willa looked at him like she wanted to believe that, but her fingers curled tight into the blanket. "I do not take in boarders," Laziel added. "Nor am I looking to be anything more than decent. Just offering help." Her eyes met his, and some of the tension in her shoulders eased. "Thank you." He gave a small nod, then stood. "Call me if you need anything. I will be outside with the horses." She watched him go. His shoulders were broad, his stride heavy but not stiff. He moved like someone who had been used to silence for a long time. Laziel worked the rest of the morning in the corral, feeding the gelding and checking the fence line. He had not had anyone inside the house since his wife died 2 years earlier. Her name was Mary. She had passed during childbirth and the boy had not made it either. After that he stopped talking much, stopped letting people in. But when Willa Carr collapsed on his porch, something in him shifted. He could not explain it, but he did not question it either. By afternoon, she was sitting up, hair brushed, wearing one of his late wife's shawls over a clean cotton dress. She had washed and braided her hair, and though her face was still pale, she looked steadier. "You have a strong firewood stack," she said softly when he stepped inside. "Been splitting since last spring," he said. She gave a tired smile. "Then I am lucky I landed here and not some empty shack." That night, Willa helped slice potatoes for stew. Her hands were slow but steady. He watched her for a moment, the way she moved with quiet care, her fingers trembling just a little when she handed him the tin plate. "Thank you for this," she said after supper. "For everything." "You do not owe me anything," he replied. "I know." She stood, moving to the hearth, rubbing her arms. "It gets cold fast here. Storms come in sudden. This land does not like warning people first." She turned to him, her voice low. "I have not been warm in a long time." He swallowed. "You will be." She blinked, then nodded once and sat again, folding her hands in her lap. In the days that followed, Willa found her strength again. She stayed in the guest room, rose early, and helped where she could, sweeping, sewing patches on old shirts, scrubbing pans. Laziel never asked, but he let her, and slowly the house began to feel like something more than just walls and ghosts. One morning, she stood at the back fence, watching the sun rise. Laziel stepped beside her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She took one carefully. "I used to watch the sunrise with my husband," she said. "Back in Kansas. Before the fever took him." He nodded. "I used to with Mary." They stood in silence, the orange light spilling across the prairie. "This is the first time I have not felt alone since," she whispered. Laziel looked over. "Me too." She glanced at him, eyes soft. He held her gaze longer than he meant to. It was not a grand moment, no sudden fire. Just 2 people standing in the cold, sharing the same breath of warm coffee and grief. That night, she sang quietly while washing dishes. A tune he did not know, but it made his chest ache in a way that was not unpleasant. He leaned against the doorway, watching her. She caught him looking and gave a small smile. "I was not sure I remembered the words," she said. "You remembered them just fine." He moved closer, reaching for the towel to dry the last plate. Their hands brushed. She did not pull away. Neither of them said anything, but something settled between them, quiet, certain. That night, he checked the door locks twice before turning in. She was already asleep, her breathing soft in the other room. He stood outside her door for a moment, then walked away. Whatever was growing between them, it was not done yet. But it had begun. The first snow came early that year. Not a blizzard, but enough to leave a soft crust across the pasture, enough to make the soil crunch underfoot. Laziel brought the cattle in closer to the barn and kept a lantern burning through the dusk hours. Willa had taken to mending his winter shirts by the hearth, stitching with a quiet focus that made the house feel lived in, not just endured. One morning, while she was boiling coffee on the stove, she asked, "Do you ever go into town?" He glanced over from the window where he was oiling his saddle. "Only when I need to." "Do you need to?" He hesitated. "I'm low on flour. Could use more salt. I could ride in with you." He set the saddle aside and wiped his hands. "Sure you're up for that? I've been riding since I was 6. She wiped her palms on her skirt. "And I've got no reason to stay behind." They left after breakfast, riding side by side across the frozen rise. Willa borrowed Mary's old mare, gentle, slow-footed, but steady. Laziel didn't speak much on the way, but Willa filled the silences with small things, a hawk she spotted overhead, the way the wind dragged low across the grass, how she missed the sound of bells on a shop door. Elk Hollow was little more than a dusty main street with a church, a feed store, and a mercantile that sold everything from sewing needles to pickled beets. A few men tipped their hats when they rode in. Laziel nodded but said nothing. Willa dismounted with a grace that made a few heads turn. Inside the store, Willa moved with a quiet certainty, collecting flour, a spool of thread, and a small tin of peppermint she tucked into her coat pocket without saying why. Laziel watched her from the doorway, arms folded, as she handed everything to the clerk. The man behind the counter looked past her to Laziel. "Didn't know you were keepin' company again." Willa didn't flinch, but her hand paused just a beat too long on the counter. "She's not company," Laziel said, voice even. "She's staying through the winter." The clerk nodded slowly. "Well, just let me know if you need anything else." Outside, Willa adjusted the saddle girth without meeting his eyes. "I can pay you back for my share." "No need. I'd still like to." He stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold. "You're not a debt I'm carrying, Willa." She looked up then, really looked, and the air between them pulled tight. But she didn't say anything more. On the ride back, the sky turned the color of slate and the wind shifted. Willa tugged her scarf tighter. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "I thought about it once," he said. "Didn't have a reason to stay then. I do now." She didn't ask what that reason was. She didn't need to. That night, after the horses were stabled and the fire stoked high, Willa brought out the peppermint tin. She set it on the table without a word and opened it slowly. "I haven't had this since before the sickness came through Caldwell," she said. "My husband used to buy a piece for me every Sunday after church." She offered him one. Laziel took it, letting the taste fill the quiet. You never talk about her, Willa said after a long moment. He didn't move. There's not much left to say. Maybe, but I'd still like to know what she laughed at. What she cooked when it snowed. What kind of woman she was. He leaned back, folding his arms. She used to hum without realizing it. Mostly in the mornings. And she liked dried apples even when they were tough as boot leather. She kept a diary under the floorboard, never told me what was in it. Willa nodded slowly. Thank you. He looked at her, something shifting in his face. What about you? What did he do that made you laugh? He used to dance with me on the porch just before dusk. No music. Just wind and crickets. Laziel said nothing, but he reached across the table, his hand resting briefly over hers. Her fingers turned under his palm, slow and certain. Neither of them moved to pull away. Later, as she stood to bank the fire, he watched her with a different kind of stillness. Not wary anymore. Just waiting for the shape of something new to settle. Before she turned in, she paused at the doorway. Thank you for letting me come with you today. He nodded once. You belong here as much as I do. A long silence passed between them before she stepped away. He sat in the dim glow of the firelight long after she was gone, peppermint on his tongue, her voice still warm in the room. By early November, the wind stopped pretending to be anything but cruel. It howled through the cottonwoods, stripped the last of the yellow leaves, and left the land bare and waiting. Laziel had laid fresh pine boughs in the barn to keep the chill from creeping up through the floorboards, and Willa had begun darning a heavy wool coat that belonged to no one anymore but fit her well enough. One afternoon, as frost clung to the edges of the windows, she found him in the loft with a hammer in hand and a length of rope slung over his shoulder. You're putting up a pulley, she said, brushing hay from her skirt as she climbed. He didn't look away from his work. Going to hang the feed bags higher. Mice V chewed through 2 this week. She stepped closer, watching the steady rhythm of his hand. I used to help my father build fences. He said I had a better eye than my brothers. He handed her a nail and pointed toward the beam. Think you still do? She held it steady while he drove it in with 3 clean strikes. Dust fluttered down between them. I never got to see much of what I was good at, she said. Too busy surviving. He paused, resting the hammer against his thigh. You're not just surviving now. No, she said. I'm not. He turned toward her then, and the hay shifted beneath their boots. She didn't step back. The light through the slats caught in her hair, and he noticed a strand of gray near her temple he hadn't seen before. I've been thinking, she said, voice quiet, about the spring. If you'll be planting again. I plan to. I could help with the root cellar and the drying wrecks. He searched her face, then nodded once. If you're still here, I'd like to be. Neither of them spoke after that, but when they climbed down, it wasn't the wind that made her cheeks warm. Later that week, while the sky wept sleet and the land turned to mud, Willa found a bundle of letters tucked inside a drawer in the kitchen. She didn't pry, just set them aside on the table with her sewing and left them untouched. That evening, Laziel saw the bundle and paused. You read them? No, they're from my brother. Lives down in Fort Collins. He pulled out a chair and Saturday we haven't spoken since Mary died. He kept writing. I never answered. She folded her hands in her lap. Do you want to? I don't know. She waited, letting the silence hold. He always said I carried things too long. Anger. Grief. I thought staying away would keep it from spreading. And now? I'm not so sure I was right. She reached across the table and brushed her thumb lightly against the side of his hand. He didn't flinch. Maybe it's not about right or wrong, she said. Maybe it's just about not carrying it alone anymore. The next morning, he rode out early with a letter tucked into his coat pocket. He didn't say where he was going, but Willa saw the way he lingered at the gate before heading east. When he returned near dusk, his face was wind-chapped, but lighter somehow. He didn't speak of it that night, and she didn't press. As December edged closer, they began preparing the attic for storage. Willa moved slowly on the ladder, careful with her footing. Laziel handed her boxes from below, his hands dusted with old flour and moth-eaten wool. I found something, she called down. He climbed halfway up, and she handed him a small wooden carving an elk, worn smooth from handling, the antlers chipped on one side. "Mary carved that," he said. "Gave it to me our first winter here. She was skilled." "She was stubborn," he said, smiling faintly. "Taught herself with a kitchen knife and a broken spoon." Willa turned the elk in her hand before setting it gently on the shelf. "You can keep remembering her. I'll understand." He looked up at her, expression unreadable. "I think I want to remember her with you in the room." The words hung there, soft and solid. That night, as snow fell thick and slow, Willa set out 2 mugs, filled them, and sat beside him on the floor near the fire. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. His hand found hers beneath the blanket, and she let her head rest against his shoulder, the weight of it settling like something long withheld, finally allowed. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the warmth held. The snow deepened to the knees by mid-December, and the wind settled into a quieter rhythm. Willa began waking earlier, tending the fire before Laziel stirred, her hands red from cold water and lye soap, her back straight as she moved through the kitchen. The way she folded the cloth over the bread bowl or lined the windows with rags to keep out the draft, it all had a kind of reverence to it, like she was stitching herself into the house with every small act. One morning, she stepped outside with a basket of scraps for the chickens and found Laziel mending a broken latch on the shed. He looked up, eyes narrowed against the sunlight on the snow. "You ever think about having more?" she asked, setting the basket down. "Animals, I mean?" He finished tightening the screw before answering. "Not much point when it was just me." "Why?" She shrugged. "The way the land stretches out here. Feels like it's waiting for something." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "You thinking goats or children?" She tilted her head, lips curved just slightly. "I suppose that depends on what you're willing to raise." He didn't answer right away, just nodded toward the house. "Come in before your hands go numb." Inside, while she peeled potatoes and he split kindling, the silence between them felt different. Not heavy, but full. Like a field just before it greens. That evening, Willa brought down a folded piece of canvas she'd found in the attic, laid it across the table, and began sketching over it in charcoal. "You draw?" Laziel asked, drying his hands on a cloth. "Patterns, mostly. Layouts for gardens, pens, windbreaks. My father taught me to mark the land before touching it." He leaned over her shoulder, studying the lines. "That's the north pasture. I thought it could take a few more rows of barley, if we cleared the brush near the fence." He traced the curve of her drawing with one finger. "You already made plans." She straightened but didn't pull away. "Maybe. Depends on who else is in them." Later, she stood at the window watching the moonlight settle over the fields, the lines of the house catching silver shadows. Laziel joined her, holding a mug between his hands. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "Before." She kept her eyes on the dark horizon. "The weight, sometimes, of being someone's wife, but not the shape of it. This feels different." He set the mug down and stepped closer. "I never thought I'd have this again. Not in a way that didn't feel like pretending." She turned to face him. "You're not pretending, Laziel." He reached out then, brushing a bit of ash from her sleeve. His hand lingered, warm against the wool. She didn't step back. The next day, they walked the southern fence line together, measuring gaps with bits of twine and marking posts for repair. Willa knelt to examine a set of small tracks in the snow, her breath curling in the air. "Fox," she said. "Female, I think. She's light. You can tell that from the prints? She's dragging her right hind leg just slightly. Injury, maybe? Or birth." He watched her as she stood, brushing snow from her gloves. "You see more than most." "I pay attention." That night, Laziel brought in a cedar box from the barn. He set it on the floor near the fire and opened it slowly. "I kept it sealed after Mary passed," he said, voice low. "Didn't think I'd ever open it again." Inside were scraps of fabric, a child's rattle carved from bone, and a half-finished quilt small, meant for a crib. Willa knelt beside him, fingers resting on the edge of the box. "You want to finish it?" she asked. He looked down at the quilt, the stitches neat but unfinished. "Not alone." She lifted the fabric gently. "Then we won't." The days grew shorter and the light inside the house grew warmer. Willa began humming while she worked, and Laziel started leaving his gloves on the table instead of tucking them away. One evening, she leaned against the doorframe, watching him read a letter from his brother, the firelight flickering across his face. "Do you think he'll visit?" she asked. "He wants to," Laziel said. "He asked if I'm sharing the farm now." She stepped into the room. "What did you tell him?" "That I'm not alone anymore." She crossed the floor and sat beside him, her hand resting against his arm. "Then he should come. He'll see it for himself." He turned to her then, the distance between them gone in a breath. "I want to build something real with you," he said. "Not just share space. Share life." Her eyes didn't waver. "Then tell me what comes next." He took her hand in his, thumb brushing her knuckles. "Spring. Planting. A barn full of animals. A home, not just a house." She nodded once. "And a marriage? If you'll have me." "I will." He leaned in, the space between their bodies closing not with urgency but with certainty. When their lips met, it was quiet and deliberate, the kind of kiss that didn't chase heat but held it. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, the fire burned steady, and nothing in the house was unfinished anymore. The thaw came slow, as if winter had grown too stubborn to let go. Patches of earth peeked through the snow by mid-March, and the creek behind the barn began to murmur again, water pushing through the ice in cautious trickles. Willa stood at the edge of it one morning, apron dusted with flour, her boots sinking slightly into the softening ground. She rubbed her lower back with one hand and looked out over the pasture where Laziel was setting new posts, sleeves rolled, his hat tipped low. He looked up after a moment, caught her eyes, and gave a short nod. She returned it, then turned back toward the house, one hand resting at the curve of her belly. Inside, she stirred the bread dough again, slower this time, careful of the weight she now carried. The seams of her life no longer felt fragile. They felt like cloth worn soft with use, stronger for the wear. That evening, as the lantern light flickered across the table, Laziel set down a sheet of paper beside her mixing bowl. "From Elias," he said, brushing dust from his knuckles. "He's coming up in May, bringing his wife and their oldest girl." Willa wiped her hands on a cloth. "That soon? He wants to meet you. And he says his daughter's been asking about chickens." She laughed, the sound catching in her chest. "Then she'll find plenty to fuss over." Laziel leaned against the edge of the table, watching her. "He says he's bringing seeds. Corn, squash, a few fruit trees. Wants to trade if we've got the room." She turned toward him, her hands stilling at her side. "We've got more than enough room." Later that night, after the dishes were dried and the fire settled into its quiet rhythm, she stood at the bedroom door, fingers resting on the wood. "You ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. He pulled back the quilt, eyes meeting hers across the dim room. "Every day." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. By April, the earth had softened enough to plant the first rows. Willa knelt in the dirt with her skirts tucked up and her braids swinging forward as she leaned into the work. Laziel drove the plow along the northern edge, the new ox stepping carefully over the furrows. They didn't speak much as they worked, but the rhythm between them had settled into something wordless and sure. After the last row was covered, she stood, brushing soil from her palms. "That'll be enough for now. The rest can wait until after." "After what?" She looked over her shoulder, smile tugging at her lips. "You know what?" He set the reins down and walked over, hands loose at his sides. "You sure it's wise? Working this much? I'm not made of paper, Laziel." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You're made of grit and fire." She kissed him then, right there by the edge of the field, the scent of turned soil and pine sap in the air. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't new. It was something rooted, something that had taken hold slowly and wouldn't let go. That night, she sat by the fire, threading ribbon through a christening gown she'd sewn from muslin and lace found in a trunk upstairs. Laziel carved a cradle beside her, his knife moving with quiet patience. "You think it'll be a girl?" she asked, not looking up from her stitches. "I think it'll be ours," he said, setting the cradle rockers into place. She reached over and rested her hand over his knee. "That's enough for me." The baby came in late spring, just before the lilacs bloomed. Willa bore down through a night of hard labor, Laziel beside her every moment, wiping her brow with a cloth and whispering steady words she couldn't always understand but clung to anyway. When the cry finally came strong and full and fierce, Willa collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaking her face. "It's a girl," Laziel said, voice thick. "Willa, she's perfect." They named her Clara, after Willa's mother. She had a tuft of dark hair and Laziel's quiet eyes. Elias arrived 2 weeks later with his family and 2 sacks of seed, and the porch filled with laughter for the first time in years. His daughter toted around Clara wrapped in a quilt, whispering stories to her as if she'd been born into them. At night, after the guests had gone inside and the porch was empty, Willa and Laziel sat rocking side by side, Clara swaddled between them. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said, voice low. "You didn't," she replied. "You made it." He looked at her, the lines at the corners of his eyes softening. "With you." The moon rose above the barn, casting silver across the fields. The wind was mild, brushing over them like a blessing. Inside the house, the cradle sat waiting, the fire banked low, the scent of pine and lavender lingering on the air. They carried Clara inside together, Laziel's hand steady at Willa's back. The house was warm and the future no longer a thing to be feared waited just beyond the morning. The land would keep growing. So would they. Together. Always.